Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is CJ Pascoe, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. Her research interests include gender and sexuality, masculinity, youth and new media, and cyberbullying. Pascoe's book, Dude, You're a Fag, Masculinity and Sexuality in High School, documents the relationship between homophobic harassment, heterosexism, and masculinity in high school. Pascoe was a co-researcher and contributing author of Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, Living and Learning with New Media. Her latest volume, Exploring Masculinities, Identity, Inequality, Continuity, and Change, co-edited with Tristan Bridges, will be published in July 2015. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's very fun.
What led to your interest in doing qualitative research on youth, gender, and sexuality in new media? Where did that come from?
It's actually a fairly longish story that I'll keep short. It started when I was an undergrad, actually, at Brandeis University. We had the opportunity to write a senior thesis, and I had no idea what my senior thesis was going to be on. I was a sociology major, and I was taking all these classes in psychoanalytic theory because at Brandeis, they were still very anchored in the Frankfurt School, so there was a lot of Marx and a lot of Freud, and so I was really caught up in thinking about conflict, both social conflict and intrapsychic conflict. And while I was thinking about all these things, I went and visited a friend of mine who lived in a fraternity at a large state school in California, and at Brandeis we had voted to not have fraternities. The student body thought that they were promoted inequality, so we decided not to have them. And so it was really my first experience with the Greek system. So I stayed at this fraternity house for about a week with my friend, and as someone who was deeply mired in psychoanalytic theory at that point, all I kept seeing were these developmental challenges that these young men were facing. They turned everything into a competition. There seemed to be a lot of dominance over women being enacted, but also dominance over each other, sort of making pledges into women or babies and then making fun of them, and everybody hugging and laughing and sort of making up at the end. And I thought, this is what I need to do my senior thesis on. And so I ended up coming back and staying with the brothers for a longer period of time and doing interviews. And so I did this very sort of small ethnography looking at the role that Greek life and this fraternity, and fraternities in particular, play in the coming of age process in contemporary American men's lives. And so I made the case as a 22-year-old that what fraternities were a really contemporary rite of passage in which young men proved their masculinity by repudiating the world of childhood and the world of femininity that they had been associated with as children, and became men, a band of brothers, right, in this fraternity. And so that really whetted my appetite for ethnographic research. I loved this way of being in the research, being surrounded by activity that I was sort of taking notes on and then going back and revisiting and coding and watching these themes emerge out of what seemed like a lot of jumbled random notes. And so when I got to graduate school and had the opportunity to do ethnographic research on any topic, I thought, wow, I want to continue to investigate masculinity, perhaps from a more theoretically sophisticated perspective. And that's what led to my dissertation research that looked at young men and adolescent boys in high school.
So that dissertation turns into eventually Dude, You're a Fag. So you go, now you're doing field work as a graduate student. You're doing this field work. So you go into this high school in California. Mm-hmm. So what happened there?
Well, getting in was first no easy process. I contacted a lot of schools and said, can I come in and study masculinity? And as you can imagine, schools said, no, you actually can't. Because I had no sense of how a researcher sort of would present oneself in one's own research. I was so in my head that I couldn't think about the fact that these schools would hear what I was saying in a different way than I meant it. And so eventually I was able to contact schools in such a way that I was able to convey to them that the concerns I was addressing were concerns that they had as well. That is, how do young people navigate the rules of gender in a contemporary society? How is it that boys become men? What are the social norms around becoming a man in our society? Which is something that the schools wanted to know about as well. And so I was eventually accepted to come study at the school that I call River High, and it was terrifying. It was, I was unprepared for how terrifying it would be to go back to high school because, right, so most of us leave high school and we don't look back, even if it was a good experience, right? It's that stage of life is done. And if we do go back, we're in a position of power over the kids, right? We're teachers, we're administrators. But I went back with no role, right? I walked in and here I was a stranger that students couldn't figure out who I was. Could I get them in trouble? Was I a new girl to date, right? I looked a little old for that. Was I somebody's mom, right? And these were all questions that kids ask me. Are you so-and-so's mom? No, I'm about 28 years old. I'm really not anybody's mom. And so it was really scary to be walking down the hall and have the hall monitor, who was an adult man, say, I need to see your hall pass, right? So I'd get mistaken in all these different ways, all of which were a little terrifying. And so I had to come up with ways to explain myself. Why was I there? What was I doing? And I was very honest with the kids. A lot of them would say, oh, are you like Drew Barrymore and never been kissed? Are you trying to be a high school student again? I would say, no, I'm not trying to be a high school student. I go to this university, I go to UC Berkeley, and I'm what's called a graduate student. It's work that you do after you're an undergrad, and I'm writing a book about teenage guys. And once I was able to explain that, students actually responded quite well, and they'd tell me, oh, you should put this in your book. Oh, did you see what he did? Put that in your book. Oh, they're having a competition. Put that in your book. And they became, in many ways, my co-researchers, right? They'd sort of pull me around and make sure I got to see different things. And I would try out my findings on them. I'd say, well, I noticed you're calling each other fag a lot. What's that all about? What do you mean? And so I'd to reflect back to them what I was seeing, and I'd try out my theories. Well, are you guys calling each other fag because you don't think you're really masculine? Is that what's happening? Oh, dude, yeah, that's it, right? And that was really helpful.
They weren't using that term as a term to denigrate someone's sexual preference, right?
Right. So that's what it was. I had this sort of complicated finding when I was there. I actually hadn't started off researching sexuality, right? When I went into this particular school, I had this very open question, which was, how do boys understand masculinity? And that question changed in two ways during the course of my study there. The first way was that I realized quite quickly I had to start incorporating some notion of sexuality, because what I heard nonstop was fag all the time. I heard fag and gay, right? So often that even when I left the field and I'd see something undesirable or stupid, in my head, I'd think, oh, that's so gay, which was horrifying, right? For someone who prides themselves on thinking of themselves as socially liberal, it was a sort of a horrifying thing to have happen. But what I noticed as I was there was that girls and boys would both use the term gay to indicate anything they thought was stupid or silly, but only boys, with the exception of two examples, used the term fag. And they used it so often that I actually lost count of how many times they used it. I couldn't keep up with it. And it would be things like I'd walk through the hallway and some boy would yell out, fucking faggot, to no one in particular, just sort of at random. It was like popcorn almost, walking through the hallways listening to this. And so I realized quickly I had to start asking them about this. And my initial read, and their initial read when I would ask them, would be something like, oh, well, guys are just homophobic. I'd be like, yeah, great, okay, that makes sense, right? We have a long literature that says men in the West become masculine by being homophobic and hating gay men. But then as I talked to them, they actually started to give me these much more nuanced answers. They had a much more sophisticated sense of what they were doing, actually, than simple homophobia. And so I'd say, oh, okay, so you don't like gay men? And they'd say, no, gay men can be masculine. One boy said, oh no, gay men can be masculine too. They can throw footballs, right? So if a gay man was appropriately masculine, he certainly wasn't a fag. And so when I started to ask him, well, what kind of things could you get called a fag for? One boy said to me, anything, literally anything. If you turn a wrench the wrong way or something, dude, you're a fag, right? And so while it's not true that it was anything, I mean, if they won at a football game, they weren't going to be called a homophobic epithet. But when I compiled a list of the sorts of things that triggered this epithet, it was things like same-sex touching, exhibiting emotion, not being competent, not being dominant, not being heterosexual in the right way, this really sort of performative way in which they enacted dominance over girls' bodies, or dancing. At this particular school, dancing could trigger around the epithet. So yeah, it was used in the service of what we now call gender policing, right? Reminding boys that they needed to be appropriately masculine. But the other thing, so that was sort of the one answer to how do boys become masculine in this day and age was through these sort of gendered homophobic epithets and performances. But I had to change my question in another way, which was this presumption that masculinity belonged to boys. The kids, you know, since I sort of took them seriously as knowers about their own social world, quickly pointed out to me that girls could be masculine too, and pointed me towards groups of girls in the school who exhibited masculinity through some of the same dominance practices that boys engaged in.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So how did this impact your understanding of bullying? Because one of the really interesting parts about your work is the revision of bullying that you argue for. Tell us about that.
I'm really glad you're asking about that. This is something I think about a lot lately. So in the original text of Dude, I mentioned the word bullying or variations of it, I think 3 times, which is really surprising, right? After it was published, I started to get these phone calls, right? Can you talk to us about bullying? We have a bullying problem. Can you tell us about bullying? And my initial reaction was, why are these people calling me? I don't know anything about bullying. And then, you know, I sort of sat back and thought about it and realized, okay, so I've written a whole book about things that look a lot like bullying, right? Like homophobic bullying, but I don't use the word. And so I just sort of tangled with this in my head for a while. Why was I using this word? So I went to the sociological literature on bullying, and we really don't have much. And so I thought, well, where is this literature? And it's in psychology. And psychologists can tell us, you know, personal traits that bullies have. They can tell us personal traits that bully victims have. They can tell us traits about bystanders. And I realized that sociology, we talk about aggression and we talk about interpersonal dominance, but we don't use the word bully. And in part, that's because bullying denotes pathology, right? If we're talking about a bully, we're talking about someone who is breaking social norms and being bad in their aggression. And what sociologists instead see in these aggressive interactions is actually the enforcement of social norms, that what these boys are doing is not actually pathological, right? They're not going to be sort of fixed on some psychological level, but they're enforcing social norms that adults have already instituted in both culture and in law. And so really, I suggest that maybe these kids are doing the dirty work of social reproduction, right? That they're informing each other about our social norms in ways that we find horrifying because we're perhaps more distant from them. But it also absolves us of responsibility for those social norms, right? Because we can say, look at these bad kids doing this stuff. It's different than what we do, right? And then pathologize them and require them to sort of get some sort of treatment.
So once you move from a kind of individualized and pathologized account of what bullying is, where you say, okay, the problem is the kid, or the way the kid is raised, or the kid's background, or whatever, and you move to a kind of sociological understanding, this problem of kids getting harassed and beaten up in school. So how should we be? How does your realization about this new way of thinking about bullying help us to understand about how we ought to respond to it?
Love that question. It's a fabulous question. Well, let me tell you how we are responding to it right now and how I think we should respond to it. How we're responding to this right now is through these prepackaged bullying programs, right? You can go online and get a bullying program for your school. They'll send in guest speakers, they'll give you curriculum, and you can hold these sort of highly emotional rallies in which you get kids to pledge not to bully. We can get kids to pledge to a lot of things in rallies, right? You get everybody hyped up and make bullying look like it's this thing that hurts people's feelings, and nobody wants to do that, right? But it really misses the kids where they're at. Lots of times they don't even call what they're doing bullying. We call it bullying, but they don't call it bullying. And so it allows them to not see their own behavior as sort of this aggression work that enforces problematic social norms. And so I think the issue is more systemic, right? And we need to get at it from several directions. One direction is to provide space in our schools for social emotional development, right? That we've moved so far in favor of testing the heck out of these kids that we have reduced them to these little testing machines rather than allowing space for discussion of their social emotional lives in ways that are related to things that we want them to learn, right? When they're reading texts, when they're reading Lord of the Flies, for instance, right? A book that is in large part about some pretty intense aggression, right? That would be a perfect place to create space to bring up issues about masculinity and dominance work, right? This is not just something that happened in the 1940s, but it's something that happens in our school now. And what would that look like? So to create space for that kind of critical thinking, not just about texts, but about kids' emotional lives. And I would actually say that we need to get rid of this notion of bullying as something that can be solved by a plug and play answer, right? That you need to attack it both through this sort of social emotional education, through rules in your school, right? If you have rules about bullying, right, the kids that those rules often fall more heavily on are minority kids, right? Racial ethnic minority kids, right? We know that when white kids misbehave, especially white boys, they're seen as sort of scoundrels or rascals. And when African American boys misbehave, they're seen as criminals. And so when we think about how we pass laws against bullying, we need to think about how that can contribute to a criminalization process, so that maybe the way that we pass these laws can't be about zero tolerance, but about something that some schools in Philadelphia are doing, which is restorative justice, right? So instead of thinking about punishment, think about bringing kids together, again, in terms of social emotional education, to have conversations about what's actually happening, right? Because if we have one kid call another kid a fag, the immediate response is, punish this kid, he's bad, he's a homophobe, right? Instead, look at the situation as one in which either of those kids could have lobbed that epithet. So what we need to do is unpack what that meaning is and give these kids a chance to talk about it. And that's the sort of thing that happens in restorative justice circles, but doesn't happen when we have a punitive model of punishment.
You've just described a more holistic approach, still within the confines or within the parameters of childhood or teenagehood.
Right.
But your account actually has much broader implications yet even than that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I talk a lot about childhood because that's what people ask me about. But one of the claims that I make is that we pathologize children for acting out, right, what we as adults sort of have instantiated in law, right? And so when you have a country where people who are enact gender identities that are perhaps not the ones that they were assigned at birth, right? In most places in the United States, those people can be fired, right? We have no federal protection for gender variant folks in our country. And so as a country, we are certainly not supporting gender diversity, and yet we look at our children and say, well, but you need to be kind, right? And so I think one of the things we need to do is, sort of as a country, is to look at ourselves as adults, right? We certainly, even in our presidential races, right, we have evidence that notions of masculinity are played off against one another, right? George Bush will get presented as a sort of manly mountain biker, whereas John Kerry gets presented as a less masculine, effete road rider, right? I mean, and so when adults are reproducing and drawing on these same problematic notions of masculinity, we need to be aware of that versus sort of just blaming our kids for doing that because they're learning it from us.
So one of the things that's really interesting in my experience, I mean, I have a daughter who's in South Eugene High School now, and you probably are aware that 4J just passed this new policy about gender variation. It seems in a certain way that in fact, in the high schools is this place where, I mean, from my perspective, it seems like there are far more people talking about gender variation, transgender identity in high schools now than anywhere else in our society. Do you work on that at all? You talk about that at all?
I mean, I think what you're highlighting is this new social category we have. I have a friend and scholar named Tay Medow who is coming out with a book called Raising the Transgendered Child, right? And what she talks about is this new category of children that we have. And you see this category being enacted or talked about throughout the country. I mean, in the most conservative states, the most liberal states, where parents will look at their young children and think, wow, well, that is a child I thought was a boy, and that child wants to be a girl. And we've developed a narrative to explain what that is about, right? And I think when parents see their children enacting those behaviors at such a young age, there's a way in which, even if they don't think of themselves as progressive around these issues, they're pulled to a place of understanding in a way that they may not have anticipated. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that in schools, especially in high schools. You know, we're a little more iffy about talking about that sort of thing in elementary schools. But I think you're absolutely right in that high schools are really this place of change. And I think one of the reasons for that, possibly, I have no evidence to support this, but I think gay-straight alliances have played a pivotal role.
Mm-hmm.
Now, gay-straight alliances, they started in Massachusetts, and when I wrote Dude, they were not in every state. But one of the things that the Gay-Straight Alliance Network did right was they went online and they posted all their materials for kids across the country to use. So any kid at any school could go online, go to the Gay-Straight Alliance Network and say, oh, these are my rights as a kid, right? Oh, I have a right to meet on campus, right? Because of the, I want to call it the Federal Equal Access Act, the same act that allows the Boy Scouts to meet. Oh, this is how I do a school climate survey. Oh, this is what I do with a club, right? It gives them all the materials they need as well as the sort of intellectual resources they needed. So this took off like wildfire, right? Kids across the country were starting GSAs, and now we have GSAs in every single state. And that happened at the level of the high school primarily, less in middle schools and really not very much at all in elementary. And I think handing kids the tools to be social activists and informing them of their civil rights, I think that allowed change to happen on this scale in a way that we haven't seen really historically. And I think that's why we see some of this happening in high schools in a way we haven't necessarily in other places.
So you've brought up these online tools and communities. The second book that you worked on, Hanging Out, Messing Around and Geeking Out, Living and Learning with New Media, examines young people's practices of love and romance during the age of new media. So tell us a little bit about your findings in that work.
Right, so this was an amazing book. We had something like 22 researchers working together, looking at different field sites, looking at how kids were using new media. And what I did was along with a co-researcher, we looked at kids in 4 different sites in rural California, urban California, suburban California, and an urban East Coast city. And we looked at how they were using social media in their everyday lives, right? And one of the things we found was that social media was central for their dating and romance practices. That is, they didn't necessarily meet people online, but they certainly used these mediated practices as ways to flirt, in large part because it took the pressure off these face-to-face moments, right? Those moments where, as a teenager, you're terrified because you might say the wrong thing in front of somebody you like. And when they're texting each other, boys would talk about how they could sort of make the text seem like they didn't really care, that it was kind of off the cuff. They'd have some misspellings, right? But of course, they spent about 20 minutes crafting the text, right? And it was something my co-author called cultivated casualness, right? That you could be like, I like you, but it's kind of no big deal, right? And that these kids would sustain relationships in online spaces. Kids are so overscheduled and they're in control of so little of their lives that the online space was a place where they could actually keep these relationships going in a way they couldn't in their offline worlds. And so provided a realm of privacy for them in a way that really freaks their parents out, right? Parents routinely were scared, when we talk to parents about what their kids were doing in online spaces. And it was sort of a pleasure to say to them, well, in general, what we see kids doing in online spaces is talking to their boyfriends and girlfriends, right? It's what we did on the phone. It's what we did with unstructured time. But these kids don't have that unstructured time. So this is a place of independence where they could carry out these really pleasurable relationships.
You got involved from this in subcultures on the internet, and in particular online eating disorder communities. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so a co-author and I, when I was involved in this new media research, we were hearing a lot about these pro-Ana groups and how dangerous they were. So a co-author and I looked at
Ana being anorexia.
pro-Ana being pro-anorexia, so pro-eating disorder. So these groups encouraged eating disordered lifestyles, right? And so a co-author and I did a massive content analysis of the 15 most populous, or the 15 largest pro-anorexic groups on a social networking site. And they've all since been taken down. They were taken down very quickly, but we gathered all of the information before they were all taken down. And what we found was that what was going on in these spaces wasn't so different than women's diet culture in general, right? They encouraged each other to restrict calories, they gave each other diet advice, they provided emotional support around the difficulty of dieting, and the claim that we ended up making was that, paying attention to these women engaged in these groups meant that we didn't have to pay attention to the fact that we lived in a society that was like, women, y'all really need to lose weight anyway. That was really sort of hyper-focused on weight. And so it allowed us to normalize the average woman's diet practice and pathologize these women for engaging in this behavior. And perhaps what was really interesting about what we found was we interviewed a bunch of the women who participated in these sites, and most of them were on there for about a year or two, and then they left. So they weren't spaces where women went and stayed, but they were a place where women went to find support for their particular dieting practices and eventually left, right? And I think sort of our conclusion was that we really need to pay attention to a culture that valorizes thinness to such an extent that women feel like they have to go get support for their dieting practices.
So the implications about this are similar to, in a similar sense, the implications that you found about bullying. That is to say, there are larger social problems, larger social inequalities that are at stake here. We have about 3 minutes left. You've just talked about the work that you've done studying new media, but you're also an active participant in new media. You are on Tumblr, you're on Twitter, and you also are the co-founder of the Social Inquiry blog. What is the Social Inquiry blog? What do you do there, and why do you do it?
Right. Well, I practice what's called public sociology, right? If sociologists study patterns in the social world, it seems like we should be actively engaged in disseminating what we found, right? Because lots of times what sociologists do is that we push back against assumptions people make about the world we live in. I mean, we all live in a world and we all have opinions about it. And what sociologists do is that we gather data and say, oh, yeah, no, your opinion reflects reality. Or we say, no, that opinion doesn't necessarily reflect what systematic data collection sort of indicates. And so what we've done with Social Inquiry is that I, along with two other colleagues, Jane Ward and Tay Meadow, wanted to create a space online where we could talk about sociological findings about sexuality. There's a fabulous blog on sexuality called Bully Bloggers that is from a humanities perspective that we just adore. And we thought, you know what, wouldn't it be cool if we had one that did this from the perspective of social science, right? That was sort of slightly more empirically focused. And so that's what that is. And what's interesting is I'm actually in the middle of writing a post right now analyzing what's going on with the Duggars and the child molestation scandal that they've found themselves involved in, and relating it to claims that sociologists make about different approaches to sexuality, because they're actually a fabulous example about sort of conservative approaches to sexuality and sex ed. So you can look forward to that coming out.
So we have like 30 seconds left. I have one quick question before I say goodbye to you, and that is, people respond to these blogs, and I was reading some of them, and some of them are like, you know, what you would expect, sort of nasty, small-minded. But you argue there's value there. So just tell me why is that valuable?
I think we live in a society that is thirsty for information, right? That we live in a society that's dominated by particular media conglomerates. And I think we're a people who are hungry for sophisticated analysis and don't necessarily know where to get it. And I think if the price of giving sophisticated analysis is a few trolls getting angry at you, I'm willing to pay that price. Okay.
Thank you for being willing to pay that price. Thank you for coming and speaking with us, and thanks especially for your work, which is really important and interesting stuff.
Well, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
I've been speaking with CJ Pascoe, newly Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. Her research interests include gender and sexuality, masculinity, youth and new media, and cyberbullying. Exploring Masculinities, Identity, Inequality, Continuity, and Change, a book co-edited with Tristan Bridges, will be published in July 2015. Thanks for watching.